Imagine you are the CEO of a massive manufacturing firm. You have just broken ground on a sprawling new megafactory. This chart shows your initial financial projections, a total construction cost of $100 million, which will yield $120 million in overall value. But midway through the build, the market shifts. You have already spent $30 million, and new estimates show the projected value of the completed factory drops to just $65 million. You have a choice to make. Do you finish the facility or walk away entirely? Finishing the build requires an additional $70 million. Because the factory will only ever generate $65 million in value, spending that remaining $70 million results in a net negative future return. If you walk away right now, your out-of-pocket future cost is zero. The math dictates you abandon the project. This logic forms the basis of what classical economics calls the bygones principle. It states that past mistakes, unrecoverable expenses, and time already spent are completely irrelevant to future decisions. A perfectly rational actor calculates their next move by looking strictly forward. If the future math demands a retreat, the money left behind is simply water under the bridge. That is the mathematical ideal. But human beings rarely operate in a state of accounting purity. Instead, the messy reality of behavior is dominated by a cognitive glitch known as the sunk cost fallacy. Take the supersonic Concorde jet. The British and French governments realized early on that the aircraft was destined to be a commercial disaster. Yet they continued to fund its joint development simply because they had already spent so much. The same pattern appeared in the 1980s with United States utility companies. Managers repeatedly mismanaged unviable nuclear power plant projects, refusing to cut their losses despite public and regulatory backlash. This effect scales all the way down to our daily lives. People stay in failing relationships because they've invested years of effort, or finish a bad book just because they paid full price. The sunk cost effect is a systemic glitch in human logic. We allow the weight of previous expenditures to override our rational survival instincts. To understand why we insist on throwing good money after bad, we have to look past the ledgers and examine the psychological operating system of the human brain. In 1968, researchers Robert Knox and James Inkster set up at a racetrack to observe human betting behavior. They surveyed two distinct groups of people, those waiting in line to place a $2 bet and those who had just finalized their transaction. The bettors who had just handed over their money rated their chosen horse's chances of winning significantly higher than the bettors who were still waiting in line. The physical act of spending money actively manipulates the brain's perception of risk. Behavioral economists call this over-optimistic probability bias. Once a commitment is made, your brain artificially inflates its own probability of success. It acts as an internal defense mechanism, working to justify the financial sacrifice you just made. But perception of risk is only part of the equation. Inside a corporate hierarchy, the pressure of ego creates an even stronger trap. This diagram outlines a classic study by researchers Barry Staw and Frederick Fox. They split business managers into two groups. One was told they were personally responsible for an earlier disappointing investment. The second inherited the failing department. Both groups were given the exact same poor profit data and asked to make a new funding decision. The inheriting managers invested modestly, but those personally responsible dumped an average of $13 million new dollars into the division. The psychological requisite of personal responsibility binds an individual to their previous expenditures. Escalating a commitment often has absolutely nothing to do with a project's actual viability. It is an expensive attempt to protect the decision-maker's ego from the public shame of a failure. When the stakes shift from corporate budgets to physical environments, the fear of appearing wasteful becomes incredibly dangerous. It manifests as plan continuation bias, a cognitive hazard where an individual stubbornly sticks to their original course of action, even when external conditions rapidly deteriorate. In 1967, the supertanker Torrey Canyon ran aground, spilling tens of millions of gallons of crude oil into the ocean. The disaster occurred because the ship's captain chose to maintain a highly risky navigational route through dangerous reefs, simply to avoid the delay of turning the vessel back around. This exact same bias is documented as a primary causal factor in a massive percentage of fatal aircraft approach and landing accidents. where pilots force a landing in terrible weather rather than aborting the attempt. In these moments, the internal pressure to justify a past decision becomes strong enough to override the basic instinct for self-preservation. The destructive power of this bias has forced researchers in the field of neuroeconomics to ask a deeper question. Is this an artifact of modern finance, or a fundamental flaw in our biological architecture? Recent cross-species studies, led by neuroscientist Brian Swace, carefully measured sensitivity to sunk costs in controlled laboratory environments. The findings revealed that mice and rats demonstrate the exact same neurological sensitivity to sunk costs as humans. It is a deeply conserved evolutionary trait. To counter this hardwired instinct, decision theorists point to the concept of separability. This requires training your brain to evaluate all future options entirely on their own merits, uninfluenced by the historical path you took to get there. Because our brains are biologically rigged to hold on to past investments, true rationality does not come naturally. It requires a constant, active fight against our own nature, and the discipline to find the courage to finally cut our losses.